All right, we ready?
Yep.
So, this is a momentous occasion. We have been doing this for a long time. I think 2021 was when we started Mixed Bag Musings after we did a few other topics,
Really?
I think. And we've we for a while we did this every week and then we did it every month. And this is number 70.
Wow.
Yes, our 70th question.
Well, I'm sorry that we lost people along the way, but it's their loss.
Well, and things have changed a little bit since we started. We
Yeah.
we were in COVID and nobody had anything to do there for a while.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think that it is quite timely for the final session of Mixed Bag Musings, for us to ask the question, what happens at the end? We did talk about what is the resurrection of the dead once. That was another question we had. So we're not going to talk as much about that, but we will review a little bit of that today. But I think what happens at the end is an interesting thing to explore. So, as usual, we will look a little bit at assumptions that the question makes. And my first gut reaction to a question like what happens at the end is, well, is there an end? Because not everybody thinks so. If we look at science, there is a lot of disagreement on, the end of the universe, the final the the um, the 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 way that the universe currently looks or is. There are lots of different theories, but the one that is the most commonly accepted, right, at least right now, is called the Big Chill or the Big Freeze. And the idea is that because the universe is constantly expanding, eventually it will expand to such a degree, it will maximize its entropy so that everything is evenly distributed. There's no more um, places, like where we have stars or other sources and other places where there is lots of energy packed into one space. It will all be spread out evenly. And if there's no energy differentiation from place to place, everything is kind of stationary. And therefore, there's nothing different from location to location. And so you can't track where you are. So there's no more space, there's no more location because you can't locate yourself in relationship to anything else because it's all the same. And same thing with time. Nothing changes. And so there's no change from moment to moment or, from billion years to billion years. And so there's really no such thing as time anymore either. And so the idea being that the universe will still exist, I guess, but that it will get to a point where life is no longer sustainable because there's not, there's no there's nothing, happening. Um, the temperatures, of course, will be really, really cold at this point everywhere because there won't be any stars to create spaces, pockets of warmth. Um, and so that's kind of the end. And then from there, it just sits there, for all eternity. But that because it's eternal, it doesn't mean anything. So that's what science is saying right now in terms of the end of things. But then there are, other perspectives besides within science. There are a variety of religious perspectives. And some religious perspectives, like Christianity, do understand there to be an end. But there are also a variety of philosophies that have more of a cyclical understanding of time, of the end. For example, the within Hinduism, there is this concept of the yuga cycle. And so there are four what's called yugas, and a yuga is a period of time. And you progress through the four yugas, and then when you get to the end, which is in the final yuga, there it's things are at their absolute worst. There is, a lot of immorality. People are suffering, those types of things. Um, and then there is some kind of cataclysm that requires that everything kind of dies away, and then um, there is a reestablishment um, to a new cycle. And then there are bigger understandings of there are different ages, that have so many yuga cycles, and then so many yuga cycles in that are available in the cosmic, sense of time. But the idea being that things just kind of keep repeating themselves and cycling back and cycling back and cycling back. And so there really isn't an end. It just kind of when you reach the end, it also is the beginning.
So
Um,
are you saying this is that individuals go through these four cycles
no,
in a
this is like all the stuff. This is the universe. This is
Oh, okay.
reality as we know it. Kind of goes through these
So
cycles.
the universe isn't, where's the universe now, according to this?
It's
In
right now
which,
it's in that one of those last cycles where
oh,
everything's bad, of course.
okay. They've been to Shasta County, apparently.
I guess so.
Gonna say.
Similarly, there's a cyclical understanding. This isn't just for Eastern religions. There's also others for this, such as the gods of the Scandinavians, Odin and Thor and those friends, and Ragnarok. Ragnarok is the end of the world. It's the twilight of the gods, and Odin is going to be defeated, and Thor will die after defeating his enemy. All of these things, and so the enemies that they have been keeping at bay for millennia will finally get them, but that's not the end, because after this cataclysmic battle, the world resurfaces. A new world comes to being. Whoever's left, the gods that survive will will continue on. A new son of Odin will be born into the world. There is an understanding within this religious tradition that there will be two human survivors of Ragnarok, and then they will repopulate this new earth to create a new people so that they can go through the cycle again. Um, and then similar in terms of there not really being an end, but also different in terms of it not really being cyclical necessarily is Taoism or Taoism, depending on how you want to pronounce it. um, within Taoism or Taoism, of course, the Tao is the center, which is it's difficult um, to define in English what the Tao is. It's represented by a Chinese character that means the way, the path, the road, sometimes the doctrine, the principle. The Tao or the Tao is kind of the way things are, um, and how life works, kind of thing. And it's not something that you can um, conceptualize on an academic level. It's something that you have to experience. It's something that you have to live. Um, and people experience the Tao or the Tao through their lives in a variety of different ways, and to a different variety of different degrees. But then, of course, they come and go. So does everything else. The trees, the mountains, the stars in the sky, all of those things come and go. But the Tao is eternal. And so things will continue to ebb and flow, and people will come and go, and physical things will come and go, but the Tao remains forever. There's no change in that. And so in that sense, it's not necessarily, the cycles of humanity perhaps, or the cycles of, different things ebbing and flowing. But the eternal nature of the Tao is what prevents the idea of there ever being an end. There can't be an end because the Tao never ends. So assuming, within our question, what happens at the end, assuming that there is an end is not necessarily something that everyone will agree with. Of course, as Christians, we believe that there is something of an end, that we have, excuse me, we at least some kind of transition, perhaps, maybe rather than an end, but certainly an end to how things currently are. Maybe similar to the Ragnarok idea. Maybe it's a little bit closer to that than we would think on the surface of it. But we have this idea. So because we have already talked before about the resurrection of the dead, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time, kind of getting stuck in that kind of area, but I did want to just bring briefly um, this concept of kind of the what does this mean personally, because I can't remember who asked this question or what exactly it was that they were asking about. Um, so I didn't want to disappoint them with not addressing the angle of their question at all. So I use the word eschatology here. Eschatology is just the from the Greek roots, and it refers to the study of the final things, the things that are at the end. And so when we're talking about what happens to me, what does the end look like for me? I think that that's certainly an important question that a lot of people ask, and a lot of people really struggle with through their lives, especially as they're you know reaching the end of their lives. They tend to ask these questions. So these are things that I have previously talked about, but this was several years ago, so I wouldn't blame you if you forgot about it completely, because I certainly did. But talking about the idea of, the end of me, what happens to me um, after, after I go. And there are a few principles that I think are helpful for us when we're thinking about it from this angle that I wanted to quickly run through. Um, I think we're asking when we talk about death and resurrection, when we talk about the end of my understanding of me and my experience with my engagement with the world and with my relationships and things like that, what I'm wondering about is is there some kind of continuity between what I am now and what I will be in, in this future that is not accessible to me right now? And it definitely has a lot to do with our concept of, meanness that affects our understanding of those things. When we look in the Bible, and this is review now from the resurrection session. When we look in the Bible, it is very clear that we as humans, we as the stuff of the earth, we as the material, um, that is what we are. And the concept, the idea that we are souls that are stuck in, in flesh, that we are somehow, somehow beyond our physical selves is is something that is completely quashed throughout the entirety of the Bible. There are some places where concepts kind of get inserted into especially some of the later New Testament writings as Greek philosophy becomes more and more prevalent. But certainly Jewish philosophy leaves no space for the concept that we are not our bodies. The idea that how did God create? God created by forming us out of the dust of the earth and then breathing into us the breath of God, the spirit of God. And so what animates us, what gives us soul, what gives us spirit, what gives us animation, what gives us the ability to interact with the world around us is God, not us. And so the resurrection of the body then is required because without your body, it's not actually you, it's the breath of God that is, living on. And so that's kind of a difficult thing, I think, for modern um, Christians in the United States to really wrestle with because we don't really conceptualize ourselves in that way. And we talk about those things a lot, even in ways that we don't necessarily think about that, when our bodies start to fail us, it's, oh, well, he has he's escaped the suffering that his body has been putting him through. And now that he's escaped that, his spirit is at peace. And like those types of things that we say to ourselves and to each other um, can confirm to each other that concept that our bodies are not really who we are at the core. But the Bible is very clear that is us. That's what makes us us. But then that causes all kinds of additional problems for us because we have science in a way that the writers of our books of the Bible did not have. And so we want to start asking questions about, well, how does that work? Because if I am, if I am made up of, yes, my experiences, my soul, that gift of breath that God gave to me is part of that. But if I am that and my body, but we also understand that after we die, our bodies decay, and then the molecules, the different pieces of what made my body goes into other things, and maybe even other living things, even other people over the course of time. How is all of that going to work? If the resurrection of the dead is about me coming back to being me, then what happens if, that oxygen molecule was mine, but it was also some other person's, from 1,000 years ago? And so we start asking all these how questions and how does this work? But I think that if we keep asking those how questions, I mean, certainly it can be an interesting, academic exercise, but if we keep asking that same question, those how questions, I think we're kind of missing the point. Um, because if we remember, yes, how is God going to, somehow resuscitate billions of dead people whose molecules have been used more than once and, all these different things? We have to remember that the initial creation was out of nothing, was created out of nothing, right? And so our understanding of the limits of space and time and matter and how molecules work and all those types of things, I think is holding us back from really understanding this, and certainly there is a limit to um, to what we are capable of um, of taking in. Um, so I think that there are some um, I think that there are some places in the Bible where we can find, find solace, find some meaning for this particular, this personal eschatology, this what happens to me in the end. Um, you have died and your life is hid with Christ in God. Of course, when you're talking to someone, you're writing to someone and you say you have died, that's kind of a weird thing to say to people. I think we don't necessarily, because we're so used to kind of reading, biblical language, we don't think about that. But you can't really tell somebody that they've died, right? Because they can't hear you if they have. But the idea of our spiritual death and our spiritual resurrection, I think is a sign of that Greek influence. Um, but I think that it actually does speak to something important for us, because if our life is hid with Christ, then all of our speculating about, you know, what happens to us in that time between death and resurrection, what happens to us after that, um, is it's all speculation. It can be an interesting conversation, but um, to affirm that trust, your life is hid with Christ in God. Um, so we can't really affirm, that after we die and between our deaths and the end of time or the end of the universe or the end of the world or whatever we want to call it, um, we cannot say that we have no consciousness, um, but we also can't say that we don't. Either is possible, but we can't really confirm either. But the idea that we are whatever it is that makes us us from God's perspective is 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 safe. That's what this was promising us. And so when we do our creed every Sunday, whether we're using the Nicene or the Apostles or any of the Lutherans only have the one other Athanasian. We say, I believe in the resurrection of the body. That we know that God is keeping whatever it is that makes each of us us secure until that time of the end, and that we know that the resurrection of Jesus in body means that our bodies as well, our lives, the lives of those we love, the bodies of those we love, the core of the identities of all of these people are important to God. And so we know that people that we have lost are lost to us for now, but they are not lost to God. God is keeping them safe and secure, hid with Christ. And then the same can be said for us. Um, so I think that kind of summarizes everything that we talked about with that resurrection class. Um, but from this perspective of, what happens at the end, for me, I think that's as far as we can speak to that. So any questions or comments before we jump away from talking about, individuals and their experience of the end, and then talking about more of the cosmic end? Good. Okay. So we're going to keep talking about this eschatology thing, and we're going to talk about a couple of different eschatological, um, eschatological, not scatological, perspectives. So, Pharisaic eschatology, or the eschatology, the beliefs about the end times that the Pharisees held, is available to us through some of the biblical writings. So Daniel, chapter 12, has has some of this. Um, I just have a little bit of it here, but I'll read a little bit more. Um, At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall be a time of anguish such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So this concept, this what is described here in Daniel, was extrapolated out into this understanding of what's called the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord is when all of these things are going to happen. So the day of the Lord in Pharisaic understanding divides this age from the age that is to come. So this age is, where we live right now, and the age to come is something different, something else that's coming. It's not necessarily away from this plane of existence, because remember, in Jewish philosophy, there is no sense of, the spiritualization of our identity. There's no sense of, our souls escaping from our bodies. We are bodies, we are physical. And so this age and the age to come are not different in terms of where necessarily. They are different in terms of um, who is involved, who is in charge. And so, what this passage from Daniel is describing in terms of the interpretation of the Pharisaic, scholars of history, is that what happens right before the day of the Lord is the resurrection of the dead, because everybody needs to be judged so that their place in relationship to God can be established for this age to come. Now, there is a dispute um, among Jewish scholars, because Rosh Hashanah is a time, yearly, when people can confess their sins and be judged, and be forgiven, be reconciled to God. And so maybe the resurrection of the dead and this additional judgment is not necessary, at least for Jews. But of course, not everybody is a Jew, and so if they universalize this, which Jews don't tend to do nearly as much as other faiths, especially Christianity. But if you universalize this, then there's the resurrection of all the dead and the judgment of all the people, particularly those who have not previously been judged based on their interactions with God in the temple cult. So this is the understanding of the quote the end for ancient Pharisaic Jews. Now, of course, there were other types of Jews that did not outlast the Roman Empire, but the Pharisees have their interpretation, their understanding kind of codified, in these writings, like in Daniel.
Is that why in Daniel it says many of you, not all of you?
Yes. So this makes sense?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm thinking, well, my daughter and her husband just got back from a trip to New Orleans. And one of the things they did was a cemetery tour because they have above ground, I don't know what you call them,
Yeah, because
coffins.
they can't bury people under the ground there because of the groundwater.
But what they do is that they hold them in the in the tomb. They hold them for a year and a day. And at the end of that time, they take all the remains out of the coffin and put them in a burlap bag and shove them to the back of the coffin of the tomb, and they go down a hole. And some of these have people that have they've been burying people like that for years and years. There might be 1,000 people or more
Hmm.
in one space there. And so I'm thinking about, well, where are all the Egyptians and where are all the, where do all these people go in the
Hmm.
meantime? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's challenging to think about in terms of the individual people, and that we can do a whole session on just that in itself, and go round and round and round about all these different questions. But I think when it comes down to it, we don't know, and that seems like a cop out, and in some ways it is. But we can't answer that because there are so many different, scientific and logistical issues that that come along uh, starting to think about all of that. I mean, we can think about, well, okay, so if this is for people, then at what point did we get people? Are Neanderthals included in this, or only Homo sapiens, or
Well, yeah,
Homo
yeah,
erectus, and
yeah.
all of
And,
this stuff.
and I'm really not clear on this thing of this age and the age to come. I'm not understanding that concept
All right. Well,
either.
let me step actually add a little bit of information because it might actually help to put it more in the context that is a little bit more understandable from, from the Christian perspective.
Okay.
And I have a second chart that will maybe help. So we have this idea of this age, the day of the Lord, ushers in the age to come, and just before the day of the Lord, everybody is resurrected so that we can judge them on the day of the Lord, and then we can go into the age to come, which is the new age where God is in charge, and everything is the way that God intends for it to be. So then we get Paul in his letters, who of course is Jewish, and he is attempting to take his Judaism and understand it from within the context of this whole event of Jesus. And for him, the event of Jesus isn't the life of Jesus, it's the death and resurrection of Jesus. So initially, immediately after the conversion of Paul and his work and his travels, he genuinely believed, and as did the others, that because the resurrection of the dead is the indication that the day of the Lord is, it's right on its heels. It's any second now. That any second now, Jesus is coming back because there's no sense of that here. It's we're in this we're in this current situation where things are terrible and our relationship with God is broken, but we get the resurrection of the dead, and then we get the day of the Lord, and then after the day of the Lord, we get the age to come where God is going to kind of, fix everything and make it the way that it's supposed to be. So when Jesus is raised, the assumption is that this resurrection of the dead has begun, right? That Jesus is the first one, and that everybody else is right coming right behind, and then the day of the Lord is upon us. But as time goes on, it becomes more and more difficult to hold on to that belief. What do
Mm-hmm.
we do in this awkward in between time when the
Yeah.
resurrection of the dead has begun in Jesus, but it has not been completed? The day of the Lord still hasn't come. And
Yeah.
so there's this whole section in the First Thessalonians letter that addresses this, where Paul is trying to explain what this delay is about and what's happening to people who are dying in this interim period, in this awkward interim period. And so he says, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. The dead in Christ will rise first, then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them. So Paul is attempting to explain what this delay thing is all about. And of course, the longer that delay gets, as more time goes by and Jesus doesn't come back, the harder it is to understand that. The disciples, after Jesus ascended into heaven, are standing there looking like, oh, he's going to come back any second. And then it takes messengers from God to come and say, hey, why are you staring at the empty sky? Jesus gave you work to do. And then they go and start doing it, thinking, oh, well, he's just going to go check on, he thinks he maybe left the oven on up in heaven. He'll be back in just a second. And then that doesn't happen. It's not any second, it's not any minute, it's not any hour, it's not any day, it's not any year, it's not any decade. What do we do with this? And so Paul still wants to hold on to this concept that he grew up with, that he believes is what God has revealed to the Jewish people. But he adds in this additional element, this additional event, that is the resurrection of Jesus. So we're still in this age. We are moving along our timeline. We get to the resurrection of Jesus, and now our timeline is continuing on. And then eventually we will get to the resurrection of the dead, and then the day of the Lord, at which time everyone will be judged. But now they're going to be judged, a little bit differently, because Jesus has died for the sins of the world, and so instead of humanity being judged, it's really going to be Jesus who is judged, and then we'll be ushered into the age to come, where everything is the way that God intends for it to be. The problem comes as that the gap between those two upward arrows, between those two resurrections, gets wider and wider and wider and wider and wider, until now, we're at 2,000 years of space between those two things, and still there's no sign of the end. So this idea of what the quote end looks like, or at least what the transition looks like, from what we have now to what we're going to have, is a challenge that Paul wrestled with, and that if we're going to take seriously the 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 witness that we find in our Bible, and in our Jewish Testament, then we have to wrestle with that as well, which I think is not something that we do much of. I think we just read these things on face value, and then we just kind of fit them into the philosophy, the worldview that we already have, to make it easier on ourselves. So does that help, Karen, to add in the Christian part of this?
Well, I don't know.
I'm not saying
When
you have to buy any of this. I'm just, I'm just
well,
giving you what we've got going on.
if you think about Jesus on the cross, and the thief next to him says, "Will you remember me?" I have a new musical group, and they have a song, "Will the Lord remember me?" Really cool song, but it's based on what that thief said to Jesus, you know,
Mm-hmm.
when you get there, will you remember me? And he says to him, yes, today you will be with me in paradise.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile that with this waiting, 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 waiting?
I don't think you can. I don't think you can.
Okay.
But when we get to the end, I think we have possible some possible things that we can hold on to. From a logistical standpoint, you can't. But I think
Uh,
from a philosophical standpoint, there are some things that we can get to here. If you just hold on
okay.
with me a little bit.
Oh, I will. I
All right.
will.
So I want to look a little bit at some of what we have in our Bible in terms of eschatology. I was going to be kind of snotty and have a whole slide on the rapture and have a have a heading that says, biblical, what does the Bible say about the rapture? And then the whole slide is empty because the Bible says nothing about the rapture. The rapture is completely made up. A lot of these things that that we as a society in general believe about the end um, are completely made up. But I want to talk a little bit about um, the concept of apocalypse because the majority of what we have from our Bible about the end is written in this form, this literary form called an apocalypse. Apocalypse is not a literary genre that we really have anymore. We have poetry, we have first person narrative stories and such things, but apocalypse is not really a literary form that we've held on to. But it was a very popular form that was used in the ancient world um, quite frequently, but it was typically used um, in situations where there was a lot of upheaval among the people on whose behalf the writing was being written. So I want to take a look at a few of these and then kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that we can glean from from these situations. So apocalypse is not limited just to the New Testament. Um, the most famous apocalypse is Revelation. The entire book of Revelation is one big apocalypse, or maybe several small apocalypses if you want to break it up. But there are many older apocalypses as well. Isaiah chapters 24 through 27 contain one of these apocalypses. And so I just want to read, a couple of these different apocalypses, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the shared traits. So this apocalypse from Isaiah 20, beginning with Isaiah 24. On that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven, and on earth the kings of the earth. They will be gathered together like prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders he will be glorified. On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the covering that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. God will wipe away the tears from all faces and the disgrace of his people. He will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. So this is a common type of description. We've got punishment. Um, we've got prisoners in pits. We've got punishment. We've got the celestial bodies, the moon and the sun are involved here, the glorification of God. But then we've also got banquets. We've got the the destruction of the shroud, the 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 division that prevents people from seeing properly. We've got God swallowing up death forever, wiping away tears from faces, taking away the disgrace of his people. So then we've also looked already at Daniel 12, but very similar situations going on here. Michael shall arise, time of anguish, um, but that people will be delivered, everyone who is found in the book. Many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So this sense of justice, right? The idea that the good people get the good stuff and the bad people get the bad stuff. And then this apocalyptic framework for understanding the end times is continued into the New Testament period. So Matthew chapter 24 has a famous apocalypse, and I've just got some of the most important pieces here, but I'll read a little bit more thoroughly of what Jesus says. When he was sitting on the Mountain of Olives, the disciples came to Jesus privately, saying, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered them, "Beware that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations. And then the end will come. Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So you can see very similar types of images. We've got a time of upheaval and chaos and suffering for the people. We've got the celestial involvement of the sun and the moon being put out, but then we've also got this idea of the ones who endure through this trying time will be gathered together, will share in the glory of the coming Son of Man. And then one more. So like I said, Revelation is pretty much just the entire thing is one big long apocalypse. But in terms of some of these same themes, we can see them in, for example, Revelation chapters 20 and 21. Then I saw a great white throne and the one who sat on it. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. So, similar themes, similar concepts. So, what do we
You had
have?
to muddle everything up
What's that?
by bringing in you had to muddle everything up by bringing in Revelation, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
I was tracking until that.
So, what do these have in common? What can we learn from this about the end? Well, the bad news is that there is a great likelihood that none of these are actually descriptions of the quote end of times. They are instead products of their historical time period. Like I said before, apocalypse is a literary type that comes out of historical times where there is great suffering, there's great upheaval. And so people naturally start to ask questions. When things are going well, you don't ask questions. You don't want to ask questions because you don't want to mess things up, right? But when things are going poorly, then you start asking, why? Why is this happening? And if you are people who believe that there is a God who loves you, who wants the best for you, who tells you how it is that you ought to live, and you're doing your very best to do that, maybe sometimes, and you're experiencing this serious suffering, persecution, war, your people are being taken over by foreign powers. You get into situations where foreign kings are actively desecrating, your holy spaces that are supposed to be God's holy spaces. Um, you're experiencing persecution for your faith. You're going to naturally ask, where is God? Why is this happening to us? Why are the bad guys winning? And Apocalypse doesn't answer that question satisfactorily, but what it does do is it provides a sense of hope. Because yes, right now things are bad for you, but you notice we saw this theme in a couple of the different readings. But if you hold on, if you hold your faith, if you refuse to let go, if you refuse to go astray, then you will be rewarded. There's hope for a future turnaround, and there's justice. We're going to finally get our reward. If we hold fast to our faith, then when the Son of Man comes, we will be seated in glory next to him, as is, rightly ours. And those who caused our suffering will, will get theirs, so to speak. One thing that is important to note for people in our world today who think that, well, if that's how it's going to be, then I might as well go ahead and start doling out God's justice now. You notice that vengeance is not for the humans to dole out at any time, even if they have the ability to do so, which typically during apocalyptic times they don't. And that's why apocalypse develops, because there's nothing they can do to change their circumstances here and now. And so we have to have these stories that help us to interpret what God is doing within this challenging time so that the result you know, can be positive. But the positive result, whether or not it includes um, vengeance, punishment for those who have done wrong. Um, if there is, then it's God's vengeance to dole out, not ours. But you also notice that there are sometimes in these writings, there's a little bit of confusion of what's going to happen to these people. So let's look back for a minute at the Isaiah. So at first we have this stuff about, God is punishing the hosts of heaven and the earthly kings. They're thrown in a pit like prisoners, and after many days they will be punished. But then the transition comes and it says, God will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all people, the covering that is spread over all nations. So, which one is it? Is it that the punishment is for those who, have wronged God? Or is it that this feast on the mountain and the removal of the shroud is for all nations, for all people? And I think that that gives us a clue about what it is that the writers are trying to do here. Because when you are sitting in a situation where, you are being beaten, and your house is being ransacked constantly, and you have no rights and no ability to retaliate in any way, when you have absolutely no hope, when your loved ones are being killed before your eyes, what you need in that moment to have hope for a future is you need some kind of assurance that God cares about you enough to fix this. And for you in that moment, fixing isn't just about putting you back where you are supposed to be. It's about sticking it to those people who've hurt you, right? Like that's just human nature. Whether it's right or not, that's just human nature. But when we look at some of these writings, there is a deeper truth present, even in the face of this human desire for human justice. That it can't be both ways. It can't be that the bad people are punished and the good people, get their just desserts, and God lays a table for all nations and all peoples to sit together and be in relationship with God. It can't be both ways. And so if we're trying to dig down and understand a little bit of, what is it that God is really trying to say to us through these passages, I would argue that it's that second part, the feasting and the everyone being together and the reconciliation of all people and all things to God. Because it's all too easy for us as humans to say, oh yes, yes, God is going to punish my enemies and make everything right. But for there to also be descriptions in these stories about, something that, unless you are in your absolute best moment, you as someone who's been persecuted can't possibly want, which is to sit next to the person who's been persecuting you, to dine with the person who murdered your loved one in the kingdom of God. I think that for me, that's my argument for which side I'm going to fall on in terms of what the end actually looks like, because it doesn't make any sense for that to be there unless that's God's message getting through despite the human penchant for their own kind of justice and their own kind of vengeance, and the hope that God will be on their side and stick it to these people who have harmed me so much. Yes. No.
Well, how does that um, reconcile with Jesus dying for everyone's sins, and how does that reconcile?
Well, so I would say, we say that Jesus died for everyone's sins, But then we've got all these passages in Revelation where apparently that's not enough because they're going to get thrown in the lake of fire anyway, right? And so that actually creates to me that creates a problem, a logical problem that is solved by saying, well, if we understand that, Revelation, like all the other books of the Bible, are certainly inspired by God. We have, for thousands of years, we have worked together to, come to the conclusion that, God speaks through these words, but that these words are not perfect. These words did not fall out of the sky. These are still human words. And so we can study this, for example, with Revelation, we can study the descriptions of Babylon, knowing full well that the person that's writing is only using the code word Babylon because if he writes Rome, he's going to get murdered immediately because nobody's allowed to criticize Rome openly without, getting offed. And so he's talking about events contemporary to him. He's not talking about the future. And we can hold that knowledge, that knowledge about how writing works and um, how the Bible was developed. We can hold that knowledge at the same time that we hold the belief that despite all of that, within all of that, God is still speaking to us in some way. And so then instead of just reading it from a surface level and saying, this is a direct description of exactly what this is going to look like, we can say, this is a human description of what people who are suffering need to hear. But within this, I believe that God was speaking to these people and is speaking to me today. And what is it that God is saying to me today? I am not in a situation, at least not yet, where I need to have some kind of hope for a major change. I have not watched my loved ones get murdered by the state. And so I don't need a writing that tells me that my enemies are going to get theirs. I should be working better and harder to not need my enemies to need to get theirs. And because this is being recorded, I'm not going to name any names, but I think some of you guys can think of a couple of names, maybe some that we were even talking about before we started recording today. I need to work hard to truly want to have that situation that's described in Isaiah, where I am sitting at the table next to that person in God's kingdom, fully reconciled with that person and with God. That's what I need to work on wanting. But we also know that there are limits to that human ability. And so it makes sense that our Bible is going to be filled with descriptions like the punishment of the people and throwing them in pits and throwing them into lakes of fire forever. But does that mean that that is what God is actually up to? It doesn't make any sense when we look at, when we look at the life, death, the ministry of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus, the overall message of Jesus. It doesn't make any sense that Jesus would say, yes, I'm here, I'm here to die for everyone, but not that guy over there. He's going to get thrown into a lake of fire. Like that just makes no sense. And so we have to figure out, like, and we've talked about this before, we have to figure out what are our theological rocks? What are the boulders that are most essential for our faith and for our understanding of who God is? And then if we come across something that contradicts that, then we need to ask ourselves, do we need to change the boulder? Or do we need to understand a little bit better about where this is coming from contextually so that we're not inclined to, just kind of bulldoze on through, or worse, take it all for face value and end up completely off track from that original idea of who it is that got it. So I think, Karen, to circle back to your question, the fact that the foundation of our faith is that Jesus died to forgive the sins of all people, that on the day of the Lord, if we want to take that frame of reference, if we want to think about it from that perspective, on the day of the Lord, no longer will we individually be stood up in front of God for God to judge each of us individually on our deeds and our lives, but instead, God will look at Jesus and say, yes, your sins have been forgiven to all of us. If that's what we found our faith on, then all of this other stuff is just undermining it at the end of the day. But because we want so badly for our enemies to be punished, we try so hard to ignore that disparity, that inconsistency. But I want to put that in front of our faces as we're talking about the end and say, is that really what the end looks like, or is that what we want the end to look like? But then if we think about it too hard, aren't there people out there who think that we are the ones who need to end up in the lake of fire? Which is now taking me into my conclusion here. So I'll pause for a second and make sure we're good to move on.
Yeah, no. No, I would rather that all the sins were forgiven, and even if that meant sitting next to somebody that I really think should have gone into the.
Yeah. So what can we pull from these things? We've got all these different stories and historical contexts that we have. Sometimes we have a lot of understanding. Some of the writings in Daniel, you can take the history of the Greek, the from Alexander's four generals who took over, and the Antiochus line in that region, and you can follow line by line, the descriptions of the 10 horns and the four heads and, all these different images that are creepy and scary and weird. And you can historically line those up because we know we have good records of all of that stuff. Some of these other apocalypse descriptions, we don't have that kind of ability because we don't know exactly what the circumstance is that is being described historically, to, in that coded language to help people to understand that there's something bigger going on from a God perspective, from the level of the cosmos. Um, but what are some things that we can glean from these, whether or not we understand that history? Well, every single time, no matter which apocalypse it is, the conclusion, at least for the good guys, sometimes for everyone, but at least for the good guys, is that God is with the people. There's no more separation, there's no more division, there's no more brokenness in our relationship with God. There's no more suffering. We talk, there's a lot of stuff about God wiping away the tears from people's eyes. There's a feast. There's, plenty for all. There's not hunger. There's not poverty. Now, to whom this applies varies. Sometimes it's for everyone, all the nations. Sometimes it's only for those who are chosen or for those who, followed along and stuck it out to the end. But again, I think that's because the Bible is written by humans, and depending on the situation and the severity of the circumstances and the persecutions or the war or whatever was going on, people need to hear a different message. And so they're going to get that different message. But like I said before, if I'm going to believe any of that is from God, what makes most sense is the reconciliation of all people. Because it doesn't make any sense to give that to the human. It doesn't fit into human nature, but it does fit into the nature that I understand God to have. So no more suffering for anyone, I think. Justice. So this was what I was just mentioning a couple minutes ago. When we read something that we know is written by a person, we have to ask, who is the person that's writing this, and to whom are they writing it? When it comes to apocalypse, the writing is for people who are suffering because, again, they're asking questions about why is this happening? Where is God in this situation? Those types of things. And so naturally, they're going to write to give hope to those people. But is at least one other group of people who are involved here, right? And so we are giving hope to the hopeless. We're giving comfort to the afflicted. But then there's the other side of the coin. There's the comfortable people who are winning. There's the Romans who are benefiting from the stripping of Palestine and from, taking their tax monies and stealing their harvests and things like that. So does it look like justice if the description is, well, there has been a shroud over the nations, and God is finally going to lift this shroud so that everyone can see clearly who God is and what the situation is with God. And God's going to say, well, now you can see the real truth. And the people will say, oh, yes, we're so glad. We want to worship you too. And then God's going to say, nope, you don't get to do that. You're going in the lake of fire because you should have figured this out earlier. That makes no sense to me based on who I know God to be. So we have to think about, what does justice look like, not from the perspective of the writer, not from the perspective of the audience, but from God's perspective. And because God has already taken care of the issue, any issue of justice we might have through Jesus, I think we should take that for what it is. I think anybody who tries to tell us that there needs to be additional punishment, whether that punishment is temporary or permanent, the answer to them is, so you don't think that Jesus is enough. You don't think that Jesus died once for all people. Because somehow, somewhere, there's somebody for whom Jesus didn't die. Or somehow, somewhere, there's somebody who did something bad enough that Jesus can't cover that. It doesn't follow. And then finally, I think something that we see in all of these is reconciliation, then reversal of broken relationships, reversal of the way that God created the world to be, whether we trace that, back to a particular situation that, the apocalypse is describing, or all the way back to, the foundational scriptures in Genesis, where it talks about how things got to be the way that they are. God is in the business of reversing those things, of reconciling the places where things have been broken, and does so even through to the end. And in the end, I think are the promises that then God will finally achieve that end. So here in question number 70, as I typically do, I leave you with one passage that I hope helps to summarize what it is that we have been talking about here. And maybe even this entire 70 question series, I don't know. Ephesians chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. With all wisdom and insight, God has made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, that he set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time to gather up all things in him, things in heaven and things on earth. So, how do we know the mystery of God's will? He set it forth in Christ. And what is that will? To gather all things in him. Not just the people who survive, not just the people who remain faithful to the end in their time of suffering. All things, all people. And we might not like that because we are vengeful, selfish humans, but thanks be to God that we're forgiven for that too. So that is what I have for you today. Questions, comments, disagreements?
Oh, I think that's good.
Yep, this summarized very well.
I still struggle with the timeline. Knowing that it's centuries, and there's millions and millions and millions of people, and not, you know, yeah, God is all encompassing, and it's just beyond. It's hard for a human to take that in.
Yeah, I think so. I think that insight about, that originally creation was created out of nothing. And so who are we to place limits on what God is capable of doing, in the new creation? That really helped me to think about it better, because you can really get caught up in the weeds of all of that stuff about,
Yeah,
there isn't
yeah.
enough matter to make up all those people and all that stuff. Well, so what? There wasn't anything at the beginning, and we believe that, God just made it. So why can't God make it happen again?
Well, there's a thing right now where you can have a green funeral and be buried and become a tree or something. Um,
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that one.
yeah, there's a whole thing about that, and um, kind of like becoming part of the earth again, and um, I don't know. It's weird. It's weird to think about, but as you get older, you start thinking about this and about what will happen,
Hmm.
and what's it all about. And I would much rather think about um, the love of Jesus taking in everybody. So that's a good way to end it. So you're saying this is the end of all of our lessons too?
It's the end of Mixed Bag Musings. Yes, we're not going to have to look at Skittles and gummy bears and licorice squares anymore,
Well,
because
that's
dun, da, 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 internet people who are still listening, thank you for sticking with us this long. And also, coming this fall, we're going to be doing a whole different thing in our monthly. So this is not the end of our meetings. This is just the end of Mixed Bag Musings. And so coming this fall, we will be doing a series on the cycles of life, festivals and celebrations across religious traditions. So we're going to be talking about how do different religious traditions celebrate holidays, and what are those holidays, and why are they there, and where did they come from, and all that kind of thing. So I think
that'll be good.
that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's what we've got, folks.
Okay.
Thank you, Katie,
Thank you
for
so
the
much.
hours and for the hours and hours and hours that you put into these 70 lessons.
Thank you
Yes.
for coming faithfully all these times, and can't believe how many hours you've spent listening to me.
It's been so helpful.
At least
Oh, it
70,
has.
probably closer to 140.
And I know, but
Yeah.
you know, there's not usually a place where people talk about the kinds of things that we've been talking about.
Hmm.
And and I really appreciate that,
Yes,
because
I've
I,
really
I
enjoyed.
liked I liked being able to go deeper into a subject, and
Yeah, I've
I just
really,
really
I've really
appreciate all the research you did.
Yes.
enjoyed learning more. All
I
right.
gotta
Yes, thank you. Have a good night. Go take care of doggies.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, see you tomorrow, Cindy.
Bye, Karen.